A lot of people view monopoly as a bad thing for society. They view it as a bad thing for society because these firms are charging higher prices than if there was competition, which inherently hurts the consumers. The thing that we have to keep in mind, though, is that when we look at social welfare of a society, it's a combination of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Therefore, if the producer is making more surplus with higher profit, that is not necessarily bad for society. So what's so bad about a monopoly is the fact that as it makes more profits and it increases the cost to the consumer, it's restricting output, which makes social welfare smaller than if we had competition. Let's look at how this can happen. So if I had this graph here, which I have my demand, my marginal revenue curve, and I have this upward sloping, let's say, marginal cost curve, I have this situation that in this case here, I'll be in a situation where if I think of the marginal cost curve as similar to my supply curve, well, for this price here, if we go back to a producer surplus and consumer surplus, for this price here, this quantity exchange, well, I would say that this area here would be my producer surplus. And then I would say that this area here, above this area here, would be my consumer surplus. Well, the problem here is that this area here, which we've often seen as being a triangle shape, is our deadweight loss. So this area here would be a deadweight loss to society. Deadweight loss to society is based on the fact that if we were dealing with perfect competition, this would not be lost. Why not? Well, at this quantity, so at this quantity level here, at QM, the marginal value to a consumer an example here, his willingness to pay, which could be represented here for this quantity here, this is his willingness to pay, is greater than the production cost of that unit. And normally, if the value to someone is greater than the production cost, this unit should be produced. This guy is willing to pay more than the production cost. It's produced, it's sold, and then you keep on moving. We look at this quantity here. This is the value to society. This is the cost for the firm. It's higher. Keep on producing, up to the point where the value to society or to that consumer and the production costs intersect. So over here would be the quantity that we would observe in perfect competition. Or this would be our socially optimal quantity. But a firm dealing with a monopoly would not want to do that, because at this quantity here, we would notice that we would have a lower profit. So they wouldn't do this. So this is kind of the situation that they rather have all of this as producer surplus than having this bottom portion here, because the gain that they get over here, this kind of upper area here, is greater than this area here that they lose. Okay? Because by restricting output, they no longer have this area here, part of their producer surplus initially. They lose this, but they gain this whole area here, which is beneficial for them. And since they can do it, they will do it. So we have a situation where a monopoly makes more profit than the typical firm, a higher producer surplus. The consumers lose, and society as a whole loses to some extent, and this deadweight loss is due to this fact that we have a restricted output level. Monopolies restrict output. The quantity under a monopoly is smaller than the quantity under perfect competition. One last little point to highlight is this idea that a monopoly will never maximize profit at producing at a level where it's inelastic. To recall why, if we think of a demand curve as we've had in the elasticity chapter, okay, if we look at this demand curve, the straight line demand curve, we said that along this demand curve we had a portion that was elastic, inelastic, and in the middle we had unit elastic. So over here we had a situation where the elasticity of demand was equal to 1, unit elastic, and then one of these two sides was inelastic and the other one elastic. I never remember this by heart, but just by going through a very quick example I could see which one is which. So if I go from this point here to this point here, my percentage drop in price would be relatively small. It'd be maybe like a 10% or 15% drop in price. However, my quantity has doubled. Therefore, people are very responsive to a change in price. So this area here is the situation where elasticity is a large number. So here we have the portion which is elastic, and here we have the portion which is inelastic. If we think about the marginal revenue curve though, it actually crosses this point here at the portion where we have unit elasticity. Marginal revenue is equal to 0. It's equal to 0 at the midpoint. So if I just choose a better color to see this. So here when marginal revenue is equal to 0 at its midpoint is the portion where I have the elasticity that is unit elastic. Why is that? Well, I guess if we think of the extreme scenario where the marginal cost curve is equal to 0, I have this situation which is costless, and I discussed this idea of a costless situation that, let's say you've produced your big music distributor and you've made all your costs to set up your album, and now you're willing to supply a certain quantity online. You already have your website and everything else, so all of those costs have been fixed and have been paid for already. If you decide to upload 10 gigabytes or 1,000,000 gigabytes, the cost to you is the same, let's say. Well, in that portion we could think that the marginal cost of an extra kind of album sent to someone is relatively small or close to 0. Well, in that situation, we said that when we have no costs, so a conclusion from chapter 6 is when we have no costs, we max total revenue when we set a price which leads to unit elastic. We said if it's inelastic, put up the price. If it's elastic, drop the price, and that was to maximize our total revenue. Here, it's the same kind of idea where we have total control on the price and the revenues and the quantity. So if we're in a situation that we have no costs, we're going to set, it's going to be marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We'll have this point, and we're going to choose this price here where we have unit elastic demand. Okay? A monopoly will never price itself in this area here where we have inelastic demand, because unless we had negative costs which do not exist, we will never reach that area because it doesn't make any sense to produce at that level. They're losing a lot of money by producing at that level. Okay, so it's either going to produce at a level where we have unit elasticity, but if you were to add a marginal cost curve here, you would see the intersection point between MC and MR would be to the left of this point here. So in most cases when we actually have costs, monopoly will always produce in the elastic range of the demand curve. which is a range where people are very responsive, still very responsive to a change in price. However, they're not willing to accept the loss of revenue on previous units that would have been sold by dropping the price on all units. Okay, so slightly different than in the past, but that's pretty much it for elasticity. Hopefully you understand clearly. The next bit will be on price discrimination, which is some form of monopoly, but in a very different context where we can discriminate between the prices of different individuals. But if you go to the Bell Center, and unless you discriminate between people who cannot buy beer and people who can beer, anyone who can buy beer pays the same price, regardless if it's a young adult, a senior, something else. Beer prices are pretty much the same for everyone. So there is no price discrimination going there, and it would be quite hard to do so. So we'll see how price discrimination works, how we could charge different groups different prices in the next section.